Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz.
Hi.
All right, so let's begin now with a controversial new bill here in Israel that has just cleared a major hurdle and may very well soon become Israeli law. This law would outlaw police from recommending criminal indictments to the Attorney General on any current and future investigations. Proponents defend the move as a reasonable measure to protect the reputation of citizens who are eventually found innocent in court.
החוק כאן בא להגן על כל אזרחי מדינת ישראל בנושא של הפרסום, לא קשור לראש הממשלה.
But here's the issue. It's largely seen as a move by the government to protect Prime Minister Netanyahu from multiple corruption charges of his own.
ועל מה אתם מגינים ולמה? על ראש ממשלה שמיילל כל היום שהתקשורת לא מגלה לציבור את האמת עליו, אבל הוא רוצה למנוע מהציבור בחוק הזה לדעת את האמת עליו.
Joining us now is a former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, who also served as editor of the London Jewish Chronicle. Jeff returned to Israel in 2006 and currently works in the high-tech industry, but still contributes a regular column to the Jerusalem Post. Now, Jeff, what is your take on this bill and its implications?
Hello. Well, I firmly believe this bill, the only reason it's been introduced is because of Prime Minister Netanyahu's problems stemming from the criminal investigations into possible bribery, fraud, breach of trust, etc. As we know, the Prime Minister was receiving what he called gifts from a long-term friend, but these gifts mounted in value of hundreds of thousands of dollars. There were regular shipments of the finest cigars and pink champagne to the Netanyahu residence, both in Jerusalem and Caesarea. And the suspicion is that in return for receiving such munificence, then Prime Minister Netanyahu went and made certain efforts for his friend, Arnold Milchan, a famous US Hollywood producer, also an Israeli citizen, and an Israeli businessman with interests in Israeli media. So the issue is, should Prime Minister Netanyahu have been receiving presents from somebody of Mr. Milchan's stature? And if that was permissible, what about the scale of the presents? At a certain point, me sending you a bottle of wine as a thank you for this interview is one thing. If I was sending you a crate of wine every week, you might think something different.
Professor, what is your response?
Well, I'm generally against the use of the criminal law to undo elections. I have a piece in today's New York Times, the lead op-ed, talking about the dangers of criminalizing political differences. I would favor a law in the United States. We have such a law. I would favor a law in Israel that says that there can be no prosecution of a sitting prime minister except for the following very, very serious crimes, and then a list of crimes like murder and treason and rape. That all other crimes, the statute of limitations has to be extended, but any prosecution has to await until after the prime minister leaves office, so we don't then encourage political enemies to target political figures in an effort to undo elections. I'm also in favor of not allowing leaks or reports to be issued by police investigators as to the nature of their investigation. I think there should be only a decision by the Attorney General whether to prosecute or not to prosecute, but Israel is so filled with leaks, many of them illegal, that it really influences and affects the way in which governance occurs. In the United States, it creates problems of separation of powers. In Israel, of course, you have a unitary government without separation of powers. And the answer, of course, if you think a prime minister is doing wrong, you simply have a vote of no confidence. You can have investigations by the Knesset, political investigations. That's appropriate. But the over-criminalization of political differences, I think, is a mistake. And I think you always have to ask yourself, what would people do if the shoe were on the other foot? If this were a Labor prime minister and it was Likud that was generating the investigation, would the arguments be the same, or would people be making the opposite arguments? We have that in the United States. Hillary Clinton is being investigated as well, and all the people who are in favor of investigating Trump are against investigating Hillary Clinton, and vice versa. That's the danger of using the criminal justice system and weaponizing it and targeting your political enemies. I think that happens in Israel. I think it's happening in the United States. I think it's dangerous in both democracies.
But the problem is, Professor Dershowitz, is crimes allegedly have been committed. They are being investigated, and this legislation is suddenly being introduced. One can't but help feel to save the Prime Minister's skin. It's not as if they're introducing legislation that will take effect after these particular investigations into the Prime Minister. This law is meant to come into effect now so as to help the Prime Minister evade if there is going to be any publication of the crimes that he's suspected of committing. Now, you also mentioned, of course, what would the other side do if the shoe was on the other foot? And I think that's a very good point to make. Prime Minister Netanyahu has already made it very clear what he thinks. When Ehud Olmert was Prime Minister and was being investigated, Mr. Netanyahu at that point was leader of the opposition, and he called quite clearly, even before charges were laid against Prime Minister Olmert, to stand down. He argued then that under the weight of such investigations, how could Prime Minister Olmert carry on with the weight of being Prime Minister? He had to resign then, said Prime Minister Netanyahu, for the good of the country. So I think the shoe has been on the other foot. At the time, Netanyahu said the Prime Minister should resign. Now that Prime Minister Netanyahu is being investigated, he's insisting, no, he can sit it out and deal with the investigation while still being Prime Minister. But go back to your point about the criminalisation of political differences. This is an issue of alleged criminal activity by the Prime Minister. The investigation is taking place right now. Something about this law strikes me as being geared as a personal law. And I think you would agree that laws made because of people and not a principle is a bad thing.
Well, I think it's a bad thing to also examine the motives of laws. You check a law and you see if it's a good law or a bad law. Look, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu was wrong when he called for Prime Minister Olmert to be criminally prosecuted, if that's what he did. I do think that Prime Minister Olmert should have been allowed to serve out his term. Think of the implications. He was in the process of trying to make peace with the Palestinians. He made a very generous offer. And before the offer could be responded to by Abbas, he was forced out of office. That may have caused tremendous difficulties. The same thing with Rabin, when he was forced out of office for his wife having a bank account. These caused enormous problems for the state of Israel and for the Israeli people. I think everybody would be better off if we could postpone the criminal prosecution of people, of prime ministers, of sitting prime ministers, until it's over. The United States, the rule is you cannot indict a sitting president. You can impeach a sitting president, but you can't indict him. And the Constitution provides that you can then prosecute him for crimes when he is impeached and after he leaves office. I think that would be a much healthier approach. What the motive behind this law is, it seems to me, is not particularly relevant in assessing whether it's a good law or a bad law. That, too, is a political issue. If you think the motive is wrong, you should hold that against the people doing it as a political matter. But I would separate out criminal issues from political issues and try to keep as sharp a separation as possible. Now, obviously, there are some crimes that have to be investigated in real time. But I think the list of those crimes should be relatively narrow. And I think the cases have to be fairly clear and compelling before you can allow the undoing of an election by a police officer, police officers, or appointed attorneys general. I have enormous faith in the current Attorney General of Israel. Israel has had a long history of great attorneys general. And I wish the United States could learn from Israel, having the Attorney General's position be nonpartisan, be something that's above politics, but still no one person able to do an election.
All right, well, Professor, unfortunately, we have to move on to our next topic. Turning now to an entirely different animal, North Korea. The East Asian country has just announced that it has successfully tested a new type of intercontinental ballistic missile that can reach the United States, meaning that Pyongyang has achieved its mission of becoming a nuclear state. Now, the Hwasong-15 missile was launched in darkness and landed in Japanese waters, but allegedly flew higher than any other missile the North Korea had previously tested. Now, Jeff, my question for you is, how do you believe the United States should be reacting to this?
Well, it's a huge problem. First of all, I don't want to say whether North Korea has actually made that jump to become a nuclear power. I think it's too early to say. And also, I have to admit, having no expertise as to what that particular point is where it becomes a point of no return. But the issue for the United States that it has to decide is, What approach does it want to take? And does it want to avoid the worst outcomes and just go for the least bad? Or is it prepared to say, you know what, we're prepared to go to war on this? Because if it's not prepared to go to war on this, and I'm not suggesting for any immediate reason that it should declare war right now, if that's not going to be the case, then what are the least bad outcomes, and how does the United States engage the international community to ensure these least bad outcomes are the ones that finally come ahead?
Professor?
Well, I think this is not about North Korea at all. I think this is all about Iran, and it's all about how to make sure that 10 years from now, we're not facing this crisis with Iran. Iran already has the capacity to deliver nuclear weapons. And once the Iran deal terminates, as it will in 8 or so years, they will be allowed to spin centrifuges sufficient to create a nuclear arsenal capable of reaching all over the world, and certainly capable of reaching American allies in the Middle East and in Europe. We have failed with North Korea. We failed with Pakistan, and we can't afford to fail with Iran, because the big difference is North Korea is not hegemonic in its interests. It just simply wants to survive. It's creating a nuclear arsenal in order to prevent it from being destroyed and the regime toppled, whereas Iran has hegemonic interests, which they've already manifested from Lebanon to Syria to parts of Iraq, and clearly they have their eyes on the Gulf states and the Sunni Arab world. And so whatever we do with North Korea has to be done with an eye to Iran. The goal has to be to make sure Iran never becomes a North Korea, because, as our guest has said, once a country becomes a nuclear power, the options are extraordinarily limited. Remember, too, that Iran has developed bunkers and underground facilities which would make it almost impossible to destroy its nuclear capacity simply from the air. North Korea is much, much more vulnerable. So North Korea will be dealt with one way or another. Indeed.
What do you think needs to happen, though, Professor? I mean, in this given moment, what should the American government be doing? How should the American government be responding?
The American public should be prepared. The American government should be prepared to wage a tactical war to destroy the nuclear weapons, but they shouldn't do it except as an absolute last recourse. But North Korea has to know that if they continue to provoke the United States, you never know what's going to happen. We have a president who is unpredictable. That's a double-edged sword. Unpredictability has its vices, and it sometimes has its virtues. I think it's far too early at this point to mount a preemptive attack on North Korea's nuclear facilities, because we don't know what the implications are going to be. It could be devastation for South Korea, for millions of people in South Korea. It could also be devastation for our allies in Japan and other countries in the region. So I think we're stuck. There's no good answer for North Korea, and containment coupled with threats may be the best we're going to do. But I think we have to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of North Korea and Pakistan with Iran. We've already made mistakes, but they're retrievable. If the United States were to announce, as it should, that it's American policy that Iran will never, ever, under any circumstances, be allowed to develop nuclear weapons or sufficient centrifuges to be able to transfer from civilian to military, that would be a very good first step.
North Korea, though, isn't isolated. As the professor said towards the end, if it feels under threat, it will attack South Korea, then that ripples on to Japan and China, and it does bring the world into play. It's not I don't think it's a country that you can say it can be totally isolated. But I think there in North Korea, we have to be working towards regime change. But there the difficulty is, of course, as Professor Dershowitz said, the reason they're going for a nuclear capability is to say, if I've got a nuclear bomb, nobody can touch me. I mean, they've learned from the lesson of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who gave up his nuclear arsenal, his nuclear plans, and later was toppled.
All right. Well, I want to talk about whether or not Israel should be getting involved, but
we have another example of a country, South Africa, that gave up its nuclear facilities, and I wouldn't say it's a country that's thriving, but it's a country that has succeeded in maintaining some semblance of normalcy.
All right. Well, I think that's what we're all hoping is going to happen in the case of North Korea. But let's turn back to Israel, the Holy Land, for our next topic of the day. The Israeli health minister, Yaakov Litzman, has just resigned. He's doing this to show his disapproval of the Israel Railway's construction work that is taking place on the Jewish Sabbath. Now, Litzman claims the train company has turned Shabbat into National Maintenance Day, which goes against the coalition agreement and the Jewish status quo. Jeff, you dedicated your last piece to this topic. What are the real issues here? Talk to us about it.
Well, I mean, the Health Minister Litzman will say, first of all, the real issue is the fact that Jewish railway workers were working on the Sabbath, which he regards as an infringement on what's called the status quo, this vague sense of laws that has been running Israel since independence in terms of religion and state. Unlike the United States, there is no clear separation between religion and state. And there was a letter between Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion at the very beginning of the state with the Chazon Ish, one of the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox population in Israel at the time, saying that Shabbat, the Saturday, would be regarded as a day of rest, that all food in Israeli government and national facilities would be kosher, and that the Jewish tradition would be respected. And the question is, how has that letter been interpreted over the years? And the Haredi population, the strictly Orthodox population, want to keep Israel as a Sabbath-observing country. The huge secular majority say, you know what, we want to spend our Saturdays the way we want to spend it. And normally both communities rub along somewhat. When I first came to Israel back in 1984 and lived in Jerusalem, there was nowhere to go on a Friday night. Friday night, you stayed at home because there was nothing to do. Now, on a Friday night, should I wish to go out for a meal, should I wish to go and see a film, I can do that. In areas that aren't around strictly Orthodox populations, and the two societies, get along. When it comes to work like the railway, which is a state-owned institution, then the strictly Orthodox feel that if the government is allowing people to work on the Sabbath to do maintenance, they're infringing on this arrangement. And every now and again, they have to react to their electoral base and say, you know what, we're going to protest against this. We're going to show we can't be taken for granted. And this is one of the items that every now and again bubbles up in Israeli politics.
Professor, what is your take on this move, on Litzman's decision to step down?
My father used to have a little store on the Lower East Side of New York, and he was Shomer Shabbat. He kept it closed on Shabbat. We went to shul, and so he had to keep it open on Sunday to make a living. He was arrested frequently for violating the Sunday blue laws. America was regarded as a Christian country, and Sunday was regarded as the day of rest. And you couldn't work on Sunday, even if you had to make a living. And I'll never forget, my father brought me to court one day when he was being charged with being open on Sunday, and he said to the judge, well, I had to be closed on Shabbat because I'm Sabbath observant. And the judge, whose name was Hyman Barshay, said, oh yeah, Mr. Dershowitz, what was the Parshat HaShavua? And fortunately, my father knew what it was, so the judge ripped up the ticket. So much for separation of church and state. I do think compromise is absolutely essential. And this is a hard case because it does involve public displays of repairing. I don't think it's the business of the Haredi community whether or not a secular Jew works on Saturday, that he'll have to deal with that with his own God or lack thereof. And I think that the reason it's a complicated issue is because it's public. Now, I also believe that people shouldn't drive through Haredi or Orthodox communities on Shabbat, that they should respect the sanctity of the Sabbath in communities where that's important. But when it comes to public sector building in mixed areas, it's a very difficult and complicated issue. I think Ben-Gurion made a mistake when he gave too much power to the rabbinic authorities, power over marriage and divorce and child custody and other such issues. And I think it's a conflict that's recurring. But on this particular one, it's complicated. I take really no position.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that a compromise agreement on the controversial railway maintenance is, quote, within reach. Yaakov Litzman is the leader of the current government coalition United Torah Judaism Party, which he originally threatened may pull out of the coalition. But the party still remains in place. Jeff, what do you think is going to happen here as a result of his resign?
Well, what's going to happen, I think, is that the Haredim are also going to want to see some more successes. That they've got one success, so from their perspective, let's build on it and have another one. And the issue that's bothering them at the moment is in Tel Aviv, and it actually goes back to Professor Dershowitz's story about his father. And he goes with little, not major supermarkets in Tel Aviv, but little small convenience stores that are now open on a Shabbat in Tel Aviv, because Tel Aviv is a mixed city, predominantly secular. There's a demand by the population of Tel Aviv to be able on a Saturday morning to go out to buy a pint of milk, to get a fresh loaf of bread. So these supermarkets are open, and it's allowed by law, by municipal law, to be open. In Bnei Brak, for example, the strictly Orthodox area, the bylaws totally forbid such opening. So it depends where you live if a shop is open or not. The Haredim want to say, you know what? We don't want these bylaws, municipal bylaws. We want a national law that says all shops, wherever they are in Israel, will be closed. That will be the next battle.
Well, I think the next battle should be over whether or not Haredim should be exempted from the draft. I don't think they should be. I think they should have to join the Israeli army. They can have Haredi units. They can come and join those brave IDF soldiers that go to Haiti and other parts of the world to do pikuach nefesh, to help save lives. I want to hear a rabbi argue that it is against Jewish law to send Jewish young men and women in separate units that satisfy Haredi rules abroad to help people who are suffering, people who are having all kinds of crises. I would say the same for the Arab population of Israel. They ought to serve mandatorily in the IDF, but in units that don't necessarily have to fight. I don't believe that you should have partial citizens of Israel who don't participate fully in the life of Israel based on either religious or ethnic principles.
Well, we could reserve another episode for that issue in of itself. So let's move on to our next topic. Just in time for the 70th anniversary of United Nations vote that called for the establishment of Israel, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence says that Trump is again actively considering moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Now, it's been a whole 70 years since UN Resolution 181, which called for the partition of British Mandate Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. This took place 70 years ago. Hundreds of resolutions have come and gone since. So why is this one so important, you know, to the point that streets are named after the date in Israel and that Arabs still mourn it? Who'd like to begin?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say it's because this was the date that basically laid the foundations for the creation of the State of Israel as a country recognized by the international community. It's one of the few, if not the only country that's been created through decisions of the United Nations. And so, you know, the declaration on the 29th of November was played a huge part in the creation of the State of Israel, which came a year later in 1948. So yes, I think it is a day to remember, a day to celebrate, and to look forward to the next 70 years.
I remember it very well. I was 9 years old. There was dancing in the streets of Brooklyn when the resolution was passed. I remember the vote. I remember who even cast the deciding votes. It was a day of enormous joy coupled with fear, because it was followed almost immediately by an attempt to destroy the nascent nation state of the Jewish people. What people forget, too, is that the original UN resolution, which has never been rescinded, not only made Jerusalem an international city, but Bethlehem as well. And you never, ever hear about that. American presidents and other diplomats are not prepared to recognize Jerusalem as part of Israel, but they are prepared to recognize Bethlehem as part of the Palestinian Authority. And yet, under the resolution of 1947, Bethlehem was part of the wider city of Jerusalem that was supposed to be international. Of course, that all broke down when the Arab countries attacked Israel, and Israel captured areas and lost areas, and a new status quo, the armistice lines of 1949, was established. And I think the United States should recognize those armistice lines and should put the embassy in West Jerusalem, where there's really no dispute that Israel will forever be in West Jerusalem, and then you can negotiate about areas outside of West Jerusalem. I hope the negotiation doesn't in any way take into account the outrageous UN Security Council resolution that declared the Kotel, the access roads to Hebrew University and Hadassah Hospital, and the Jewish Quarter to be illegally occupied territories. Occupied from whom? It's an absurd conclusion, one of the worst legacies of the Obama administration, and one of the worst legacies of the United Nations.
All right, Professor. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for your time, and we also want to thank our guest, Jeff Barak. If you would like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to ILTV or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.